They decided I was replaceable long before they ever said it out loud. That's the part people don't understand. It wasn't a single argument. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a series of small decisions, made quietly, while I was still in the room. At first, I didn't recognize it for what it was. I told myself I was being sensitive. That happens when you want peace more than clarity. You explain away behavior, because admitting the truth would mean doing something about it. And I wasn't ready for that. When I married into their family, I believed what most people believe at the beginning. That respect would come with time. That effort would be noticed. That loyalty mattered. I showed up early to gatherings. I remembered birthdays. I stayed neutral when opinions clashed. I was careful with my words. Careful with my tone. Careful not to offend. That carefulness slowly turned into invisibility. It started with conversations that didn't pause when I entered the room. Plans made without looking in my direction. Decisions announced after they were already finalized. No one asked what I thought. No one asked if it worked for me. And when I did speak, the response was always polite and dismissive. That's nice, but we've already decided. Polite dismissal is the most efficient way to erase someone. The first time I noticed it clearly was at a family dinner. Nothing special. Just one of those routine gatherings that blend into the calendar. I'd spent the afternoon preparing food they liked. Things I knew they preferred, even though no one ever asked me. Halfway through the meal, a conversation started about an upcoming family event. Dates were discussed. Locations agreed upon. Responsibilities assigned. I listened. I waited. No one looked at me. When I finally asked where it would be held, the room went quiet for just a second too long. "Oh," someone said, smiling, "we assumed you wouldn't mind either way." That was the moment I realized something important. Assumption is power. If people assume you'll adapt, they stop consulting you. If they assume you'll accept, they stop respecting you. If they assume you won't leave, they stop caring how they treat you. I smiled back. I nodded. I said nothing. Silence has a way of teaching people the wrong lesson. After that, it escalated. Slowly, carefully, almost intelligently. I have to give them that. There were no raised voices. No insults that could be quoted later. Just patterns. I would arrive, and seating was already arranged. Always with me at the edge. I would offer help, and someone else's suggestion would be accepted instead. I would share an idea, and minutes later someone else would repeat it, louder, and receive approval. If I withdrew, I was distant. If I participated, I was a bit much. There was no winning position. Only toleration. The worst part wasn't what they did. It was how confidently they did it. Confidence only comes when people believe there will be no consequences. Then came the comments. Not openly cruel. Just sharp enough to land, soft enough to deny. "You're very adaptable," one of them said once, smiling like it was a compliment. Adaptable is what people call you when they plan to bend you. Another time, someone laughed and said, "Well, if things don't work out, life goes on." They didn't say whose life. I noticed how often my name was replaced with pronouns. How often decisions were framed as necessities rather than choices. How often I was thanked for understanding things I had never agreed to. Understanding became my assigned role. The real shift happened when they stopped pretending my presence mattered. There was a conversation. Again, right in front of me. About future plans. About changes. About adjustments that would directly affect my daily life. Someone finally turned to me, not to ask, but to inform. "You'll be fine with it," they said. Not a question. A conclusion. That was the moment the word replaceable took shape in my mind. Not because they wanted me gone, but because they believed they could rearrange everything without me. Replaceable doesn't always mean removable. Sometimes it just means irrelevant. I went home that night and sat quietly. I replayed conversations, expressions, pauses, the way decisions were announced instead of discussed. And I saw it clearly for the first time. They didn't fear my reaction. They didn't anticipate resistance. They didn't consider the loss. That's when people decide you're replaceable. I could have confronted them then. Many people would have. I could have demanded respect, drawn lines, made speeches. But confrontation only works when the other side believes you'll follow through. They didn't. And I knew that if I pushed back emotionally, I would only confirm what they already believed. That I was reactive, dependent, and predictable. So I did the opposite. I became agreeable. Not submissive. Strategic. I stopped correcting them. Stopped offering opinions. Stopped volunteering information. I smiled more. Spoke less. Accepted changes without hesitation. I let them think their assessment was correct. That I needed them more than they needed me. That I would adjust to whatever they decided. The relief in the room was immediate. People relax when they believe you've surrendered. They grew bolder. More open. Less careful. They spoke freely around me, assuming I wasn't listening. Or worse, that I didn't understand. That was their mistake. Because while they were growing comfortable, I was paying attention. And comfort has a way of making people careless. That was when I stopped trying to belong. And started preparing to be absent. Not physically, but strategically. People mistake silence for acceptance. That's because most silence is acceptance. Most people go quiet when they are tired, afraid, or defeated. That's why no one noticed when my silence changed. I didn't withdraw all at once. That would have raised questions. I adjusted in ways that looked harmless. Reasonable. Even cooperative. I started declining invitations politely. Next time. Another day. I reduced my presence just enough to be missed. But not enough to be chased. When I did attend, I stayed pleasant. Neutral. I laughed at the right moments. I agreed when agreement was expected. I became easy to have around. That's when they stopped watching me closely. People only monitor those they think might cause problems. I listened more than I spoke. And when you listen long enough, patterns reveal themselves. You start to hear what's said casually. And what's never said at all. I noticed who spoke with authority and who followed. Who made decisions and who justified them afterward. I noticed which opinions mattered, and which were tolerated only until someone better spoke. And I noticed something else. They talked about me as if I weren't permanent. Not openly. Not cruelly. But hypothetically. If things change. If circumstances shift. Well, we'll see how it works out. No one says those things about someone they consider essential. That's when I stopped centering my emotions and started observing their structure. Families, like companies, run on systems. Roles. Expectations. Unspoken hierarchies. Once you understand the system, you understand where pressure points exist. And more importantly, where they don't. I realized I had been fighting in the wrong place all along. I had been trying to earn emotional validation in a system that only respected leverage. So I stopped investing emotionally. Instead, I invested quietly. I reviewed old conversations in my mind, not for pain, but for information. I remembered who insisted on what. Who benefited from which decision. Who took credit. Who avoided responsibility. I noticed how often my flexibility had been used to smooth over their conflicts. How my compliance had kept peace that didn't benefit me. And I stopped doing that too. I didn't announce boundaries. I simply stopped filling gaps. If something wasn't my responsibility, I let it fail quietly. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just enough to be noticed. At first, they assumed it was temporary. A phase. Stress. Mood. They gave me space. Then inconvenience began to creep in. Small things went undone. Minor misunderstandings turned into delays. Plans required extra coordination. Someone had to step in where I used to. No one blamed me. They didn't even connect it to me. That's the advantage of being underestimated. I also began restructuring my life in ways that weren't visible to them. I organized my finances. I reviewed documents I had ignored for years. I asked questions I should have asked earlier. Not loudly. Casually. Privately. I stopped sharing future plans. Stopped explaining decisions. Stopped seeking approval. And when they asked why, I smiled and said, I'm just simplifying things. People rarely argue with simplification. Time passed. Months, not days. Long enough for them to forget what my presence had provided. Long enough for them to assume the balance they enjoyed was permanent. They grew more relaxed. They spoke more freely again. They joked about what ifs and alternatives. About how easily things could adjust if someone didn't fit anymore. They said it casually. Confidently. That's when I knew they believed I was still replaceable. What they didn't know was that I had already removed myself from the position they thought they could replace. I had shifted my role without announcing it. I was no longer the buffer. No longer the adapter. No longer the quiet fixer. I was a witness. And witnesses don't interfere. They record. I documented things. Mentally, at first. Then more carefully. Conversations. Decisions. Contradictions. Timelines. I didn't collect evidence for confrontation. I collected clarity. Because confrontation asks for permission. Clarity doesn't. There was a moment. Subtle, but telling. When someone mentioned a decision that directly affected me and then paused. Just briefly. They glanced at me. Not to ask. To assess. To see if I would object. I didn't. I nodded. Smiled. Said, that makes sense. The relief was immediate. That's when I understood how deeply they believed their own version of me. They believed I was compliant by nature. That my silence was consent. That my patience was weak. They mistook restraint for dependence. And because of that, they became careless. They stopped aligning their stories. Stopped checking facts. Stopped guarding language. They assumed I wasn't keeping score. That assumption was the most valuable thing they gave me. Because by the time they realized I was no longer invested emotionally, I had already disengaged structurally. They thought I was still standing in the same place. I wasn't. I had moved. Quietly, deliberately. Out of reach. And I hadn't said a word about it. Section 3. The misdirection, the consequence, and the moral, almost equals 1,000 words. By the time they noticed something had changed, they were already asking the wrong questions. They assumed distance meant resentment. They assumed silence meant emotional withdrawal. They assumed I was preparing to leave. That assumption protected them from the truth. Because I wasn't leaving. I was letting the structure they relied on expose itself. What they never understood was this: I didn't need to confront them to change the outcome. I only needed to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own decisions. And once I stepped aside, those consequences moved faster than I expected. The first cracks appeared quietly. Plans that used to run smoothly began to stall. Miscommunications piled up. Someone forgot something important. Someone else misunderstood a responsibility I used to manage without acknowledgement. They started correcting each other. Then blaming. Then revisiting decisions they were once so confident about. I stayed neutral. When asked for my opinion, I offered facts. Not solutions. Facts make people uncomfortable when they are used to being reassured. At one point, someone laughed and said, "We'll figure it out." We always do. I smiled and agreed. But something in their tone had shifted. Confidence had been replaced with uncertainty. That's what happens when people realize the system they depended on was never automatic. It was maintained. And they hadn't been maintaining it. They began involving me again. Slowly. Carefully. Not with apologies, but with invitations. What do you think? Does this make sense? Can you help us understand this? I answered politely. But I didn't step back into my old role. I noticed how surprised they seemed when things didn't immediately improve. They assumed access equaled control. They were wrong. The moment that changed everything didn't look dramatic. There was no argument. No raised voices. No final showdown. It was a conversation about a future decision. One they believed was already settled. They spoke about it confidently, outlining how things would work, who would do what, and how everyone would adjust. Someone turned to me and said, almost casually, "You're okay with this, right?" The room waited. I could have said yes. I could have explained why I wasn't. Instead, I said something else. I won't be involved. No anger. No justification. Just a statement. The silence that followed was unfamiliar. Not tense. Confused. How, someone asked. In any of it, I replied. They exchanged glances. Someone laughed lightly, assuming I was joking. I'm serious, I added, still calm. You should plan as if I'm not part of the equation. That was the moment they finally understood what replaceable actually meant. Because replacement works both ways. They tried to negotiate. Not openly. Subtly. They reframed the decision. Softened the language. Suggested compromises that sounded reasonable on the surface. I listened. Then I repeated the same sentence. I won't be involved. No accusations. No history lessons. No emotional appeal. Just a boundary that didn't require their agreement. That's when discomfort turned into concern. They asked why. I told them the truth. But not the version they expected. I don't fit into how decisions are made here, I said. And I don't want to pretend that I do. No blame. No attack. Just alignment. People don't know how to argue with alignment. They expected resentment. They expected bitterness. They expected a list of grievances. What they got was detachment. And detachment unsettles people more than anger ever could. Over time, things changed. But not the way revenge stories usually promise. No one collapsed financially. No public apologies were made. No dramatic confessions followed. What happened instead was slower. They became cautious around me. More careful with words. less confident in assumptions. They realized I no longer existed to absorb discomfort. And because of that, they had to carry it themselves. Some relationships cooled. Others adjusted. A few improved. But not because I demanded respect. Because they finally understood I didn't require their approval to function. The irony is this: once I stopped trying to be irreplaceable, they stopped treating me as disposable. But by then, something had shifted permanently. I no longer needed their validation. And that was the real consequence. Not for them. For me. They still believe, in some quiet corner of their minds, that they won. That they kept control. Those things worked out. I don't correct them. Because the truth isn't that I outplayed them. The truth is simpler. And harder to accept. I stopped negotiating my place in a system that only valued me when I was convenient. And once I did that, their power over me disappeared. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Completely. Sometimes revenge isn't about watching someone fall. Sometimes it's about watching them realize. Too late. That you were never as dependent as they assumed. And by the time they ask themselves whether I was ever truly replaceable, the answer no longer matters to me.